Surveillance camera footage from the emergency room of St. Joseph Hospital captured the moment a woman hurriedly entered the hall, clutching someone wrapped in a blanket. The video clearly shows her loudly calling for help and nervously looking around. The nurse at the reception desk would later note that there was something theatrical about her behavior, as if she had rehearsed every word beforehand. The woman's name is Chloe Benson. She immediately tells the doctors that an accident has occurred. Lily had supposedly injured herself in her sleep. Chloe emphasizes that she recognized the seriousness of the situation at once and drove to the hospital immediately. However, the initial examination raises doubts among the doctors. Superficial bruises could be explained by the described situation, but a more detailed examination reveals marks that were obviously made long before that night. A deeper investigation shows serious internal injuries that are in no way consistent with Chloe's version. The medical staff acts according to standard protocol. Chloe remains in the hallway, constantly stressing how quickly and correctly she acted, and repeating that she is worried about Lily's condition and her mother's reaction. Towards morning, the doctors have to stop resuscitation efforts. The official report states, "The cause of the incident was a ruptured spleen with severe consequences of internal bleeding." The medical facts categorically contradict Chloe's words. From this moment on, the case is officially no longer considered a simple accident, and the matter is handed over to the police, who will begin to meticulously reconstruct the events of that night. When investigators began to look into who Chloe Benson was and what her relationship was to Sarah and Lily, one thing immediately became obvious. At first glance, there was nothing unusual in this story. No entries whatsoever in the police archives, no complaints from neighbors, and no alarming reports from social services. Chloe led a quiet life in a cozy suburb of Lexington, regularly smiled at her neighbors and helped them when needed. She knew how to be needed. And if it weren't for the tragic circumstances of that night, probably no one would have thought about who she really was. Sarah and Chloe had been friends since their school days. They spent their childhood on neighboring streets, and everyone knew how close their relationship was. But after school, the friends' paths diverged a little. Sarah became a nurse and found a job at the local St. Joseph Hospital, while Chloe could never find a permanent job and got by with odd jobs and social benefits. However, difficulties in Sarah's life brought them back together. After a complicated divorce, Sarah found herself in a difficult financial situation, forced to work at night and take on double shifts to pay bills and provide for Lily. It was precisely then that Chloe reappeared and offered her help. At first, this seemed like a real salvation to Sarah. Chloe would pick up Lily when Sarah went to her night shift, feed her, put her to bed, and completely replace the family that Sarah no longer had. Gradually, Sarah became more and more accustomed to the idea that Chloe was the only person she could rely on. Colleagues recalled that Sarah often looked exhausted and restless, and the only thing that calmed her were the messages from Chloe, which she received on her phone almost hourly. Sarah never doubted her, never asked unnecessary questions, even when the situation looked suspicious. Every explanation from Chloe was taken as absolute truth. It was for this very reason that Sarah did not immediately notice the strange coincidences that began to happen when Lily was left alone with Chloe. Every little incident or ailment of Lily's was explained logically and convincingly. When bruises appeared, Chloe calmly explained that Lily had simply fallen on the playground or accidentally bumped herself while playing. Sarah believed it, and Chloe, as if to reinforce her trust, assured her each time that everything was under control and there was no reason to worry. Later, when the police examined the correspondence between the friends, it turned out that Sarah truly perceived Chloe as the only person close to her, repeating several times that she simply couldn't manage without her. Chloe always responded with unchanging care, thus solidifying her complete emotional dependence. By the time of the tragedy, it became obvious. Chloe was the only person who was constantly near Lily when something strange happened. Sarah could not imagine that she had entrusted the most precious thing to a person who could abuse that trust for their own purposes. Now, the police were faced with the task of finding out in what way Chloe had used that trust. When investigators studied Lily's medical records in detail, it quickly became clear that the events of December 28th were far from the first disturbing incident in the last 5 weeks. At first, no one had paid attention to these cases, as each one, taken on its own, looked like a completely ordinary incident. But now, after the tragedy, the police began to see a pattern. The first unusual case was registered about a month before the main events, on November 25th. That night, Sarah was at work when she received a call from Chloe. Chloe calmly and confidently reported that Lily had fallen from the swing at the playground. Although the injuries looked insignificant, Chloe herself insisted that it would be better to show Lily to a doctor. Sarah, who was under her strong influence, agreed and took Lily to the hospital the next day. The doctor who examined the bruises determined that the injuries were superficial and there were no serious problems. He made a standard entry in the medical record: minor soft tissue contusions. Chloe was confident and calm, explained the circumstances clearly, and convinced the medical staff of the ordinary nature of the situation. The doctors had no suspicions, as such visits were common, especially from concerned parents. 2 weeks later, on December 9th, a new incident of a more serious nature occurred. Sarah was on duty at the hospital again when Chloe urgently reported that Lily was unwell, severe vomiting, suspected poisoning. This time, Sarah herself asked Chloe to bring Lily to the hospital urgently, as she feared for her condition. The doctors immediately conducted examinations, but no signs of serious poisoning were found. After several hours of observation, Lily's condition normalized. The medical staff concluded that it was something similar to a food allergy or a mild stomach upset. A brief entry appeared in the medical record: possible food poisoning. And this time too, Chloe was extremely confident, convincing, and logical. Sarah, suffering from constant stress and fatigue from work, was grateful to her friend for her quick reaction and help. The main question that occupied the investigators was, why hadn't the doctors connected these events earlier? It turned out to be simple. Each case was handled by different medical teams working on different shifts. The lack of a centralized database meant that none of the doctors saw the whole picture. Each situation looked typical and raised no additional questions. It was precisely because of this fragmentation that the picture remained hidden for a long time. However, after the tragedy, when the investigators collated all the medical documentation, they saw that there had been significantly more visits in the last 5 weeks. Moreover, the requests for help at the hospital were not always on Sarah's initiative. Often it was Chloe who insisted, demonstrating increased care and concern for Lily's health. The doctors perceived this persistence as an expression of normal anxiety from an adult responsible for someone else's child, and saw no reason for doubt. But the investigators paid attention to the most important connecting factor of all the incidents. Every episode happened in Sarah's absence, when only her close family friend remained with Lily. Sarah, who was at work, relied completely on Chloe's words and never asked unnecessary questions, considering her explanations to be the only truth. Thus, what initially looked like a chain of ordinary domestic accidents turned into an obvious pattern pointing to a specific person. The investigators noted in the protocol that in all cases where medical help was sought, the only adult controlling the situation was Chloe Benson. Now the police had their first lead. All roads led to Chloe. Early on the morning of December 30th, investigators received the preliminary report from the forensic medical examination. 2 days after the tragedy, the police finally had a clear medical opinion, on the basis of which they could proceed to concrete investigative actions. The examination was conducted by Dr. David Clark, a senior forensic medical examiner with many years of experience. In his report, he first pointed out that the nature of the injuries to Lily's internal organs was not consistent with the version of a fall from a low height described by Chloe. The doctor emphasized that such injuries typically occur from a serious direct impact, most likely a blow delivered by another person. Furthermore, The expert identified healing fractures of several ribs, which were about 2 to 3 weeks old. No one had noticed these injuries before, neither Sarah nor the medical staff. The expert clearly indicated that fractures of this type are extremely rare by accident and almost always result from rough handling or direct pressure. Sarah probably did not even suspect the existence of these injuries, as there might have been no external signs at all. The fatal injury was to the abdomen, a ruptured spleen. The forensic examiner stated that the cause was a strong, targeted blow that cannot be explained by a domestic fall. However, he explicitly stressed that the medical data did not allow him to say definitively whether this blow was intentional or the result of gross negligence. Around noon on the same day, the investigative team, together with the district attorney, decided to change the classification of the case from an accident to a criminal investigation for grievous bodily harm resulting in death. In doing so, the investigation deliberately did not exclude any versions, neither negligence nor intentional acts. The investigators had already received authorization to examine phone records and quickly checked the internet queries from Chloe's device. About an hour before arriving at the hospital, a search was made from her phone for spleen injury symptoms, internal bleeding signs. How long can you go without seeing a doctor for an abdominal injury? This data indicated that Chloe was aware of the seriousness of the situation earlier than she claimed to the police. Nevertheless, the investigation could not yet say with certainty whether this was an attempt to cover up a crime or a panicked reaction after an accidental incident. Additionally, surveillance camera footage from near the suspect's house was examined. Around midnight, Chloe came out of the house several times, once with what looked like a bundle or a towel. This footage clearly did not align with her initial statements that she had gone to the hospital immediately after the fall. The investigators summoned Sarah for another questioning. When she learned of the report, Sarah reacted emotionally and for a long time refused to believe that Chloe could have harmed Lily. But when the detectives calmly presented her with the medical facts, Sarah gradually began to realize the full seriousness of the situation and understood how little she knew about what was happening in her own home. After the reclassification of the case, the police re-examined the previous hospital visits. It became obvious that the old medical episodes could be directly related to the injuries found by the experts. However, Chloe had been so convincing and calm during each visit that no suspicion arose among the medical staff. Now, every detail, the correspondence, phone conversations, and the suspect's behavior took on a new meaning. The investigation was waiting for the results of additional expert examinations to get a complete picture of the incident and to establish the exact circumstances of each episode. The expert report from December 30th allowed the investigators to officially move from assumptions to a criminal investigation. Now, the main task for the police was to determine Chloe's true motives and intentions, whether the tragedy was the result of gross negligence or deliberate, planned actions. After receiving the results of the forensic medical examination, the detectives began to check the family's inner circle. Chloe remained the main figure in the investigation, but the police were obliged to consider alternative versions as well. In such cases, the ex-husband usually comes under suspicion first. In this case, that was Mark Welsh. The divorce between Sarah and Mark was difficult, accompanied by conflicts over finances and custody. The child support set by the court was substantial and Mark paid it regularly, but even that was not enough to cover the mortgage and loan costs that fell on Sarah's shoulders after the divorce. It was precisely the need to maintain their accustomed standard of living and pay for the apartment that forced Sarah to take on extra shifts and work at night. This detail explained to the investigators why Sarah was under constant financial and emotional pressure despite the significant child support. In addition to financial issues, there was personal animosity between the ex-spouses, which often manifested in short and emotional conversations. The investigators examined Mark's correspondence and phone calls to find any signs of conflict immediately before the incident. The last contact took place a few days before the tragedy and was formal, without threats or aggression. Additionally, the detectives checked the data on Mark's whereabouts on the night of the tragedy. According to testimony from colleagues, Mark was on a business trip in Chicago, but the investigators were obliged to verify this. They requested the GPS tracker data from his company car, corporate credit card statements, and phone records. The GPS data fully confirmed that the car had left Louisville on the morning of December 26th and was in the Chicago, Illinois area until the evening of December 29th. The corporate card records showed a car refueling in a Chicago suburb on the evening of December 27th, at the exact moment Chloe was taking Lily to the hospital in Lexington. The phone records also showed that Mark's phone was within the range of Chicago cell towers on the night of the tragedy. He did not call Sarah or Chloe, nor did he contact anyone from their circle of acquaintances related to the case. The investigation additionally examined Mark's correspondence and social media activity, but no connections to Chloe were found during this period. While checking Mark's circle and contacts, the detectives discovered an unexpected fact. Many years ago, he and Chloe had known each other, and quite well. They had studied together in college, and for a time there was a romantic relationship between them. This information was confirmed by several mutual acquaintances. Nevertheless, a careful check showed that after Mark's marriage to Sarah, there were no more contacts with Chloe. Their paths had completely diverged, and the detectives found not even indirect evidence of communication or interaction between them in recent years. Thus, after checking all available evidence, Mark's alibi was fully confirmed. He had no physical possibility of being in Lexington on the night of the tragedy and therefore could not have been involved in what happened. The detectives removed him from the list of suspects. The check on the ex-husband was not just a formality. It confirmed that the version of an external party's involvement was completely ruled out, and now the circle of investigation became even tighter. The entire focus of the investigators was concentrated on the only person who was truly with Lily at the crucial moment: Chloe Benson. Now, the investigators had to clarify the true motives of her actions and find out how long she had managed to hide what was happening from those around her. After all other versions were ruled out, the investigation once again focused on the only person who was with Lily on that fateful night: Chloe Benson. During interrogations, she spoke calmly, confidently, without the slightest sign of nervousness. Her version sounded the same with each repetition. Lily had been sleeping in the guest room, fell out of bed in her sleep, and injured her abdomen in the process. Chloe claimed that she initially noticed nothing serious, and later, when the condition worsened, she drove her to the hospital. At first glance, her explanation seemed logical. Chloe's words did not contradict everyday logic, and for the time being, the police had no direct evidence to prove otherwise. Medical experts doubted that the injuries could have been sustained in a fall, but medical conclusions alone were not enough to obtain a search warrant. The situation changed because of Sarah. A few days later, she came to the police station and brought a photograph taken on December 18th, 10 days before the tragedy. The picture showed a large bruise on Lily's arm. Sarah recounted that Lily had been with Chloe that evening, and that Chloe had explained the origin of the bruise. She said Lily had bumped herself on the corner of the coffee table in the living room. At the time, it sounded mundane and raised no doubts. Chloe always seemed extremely reliable and attentive, and Sarah believed her every word. Now, after some time had passed, Sarah thought for the first time. In her apartment, where Lily spent most of her time, the coffee table was round with no sharp edges. It turned out that it was about a different table, the one that was in Chloe's house. And if the bruise appeared precisely when Lily was at Chloe's, then the version of an unfortunate fall required verification. The detectives recorded this information and went to Chloe's house under the pretext of clarifying details of the interrogation. Formally, this was not yet a search. They had no legal right to it, but they had the opportunity to conduct a visual inspection in the owner's presence. When Chloe let them into the living room, the investigators immediately noticed a detail Sarah had mentioned in passing. The coffee table was indeed in the middle of the room, square, with sharp metal corners. This fact completely turned the context of her story on its head. For the first time, the investigation had a material contradiction. The bruise captured in the photograph corresponded in its position to the height and shape of the table corner in Chloe's house, which meant that the version that Lily had bumped herself at Sarah's was a lie from the very beginning. The photograph, Sarah's testimony, and the detailed description of the furniture formed the basis for an official report. For the police, this was the first direct proof that Chloe was deliberately distorting facts. According to procedure, the presence of a documented discrepancy between the testimony and reality gave the investigation a legal basis to apply to the court for an authorized search warrant. That same day, the search warrant was signed by the Fayette County judge. The detectives were granted the right to enter Chloe Benson's house and seize items, documents, and records that could shed light on what was really happening in her home. They knew. Behind this immaculate cleanliness, there was something that Chloe was hiding most of all. Now the investigation had everything necessary to move from assumptions to direct evidence. A search was imminent, one that would show how deeply Chloe had hidden the truth. After obtaining the official search warrant for Chloe's house, detectives seized several items, among which the suspect's mobile phone was the most important. Although the police already had information about suspicious queries, the specialists from the cyber department could now fully restore the entire digital history of that evening. The analysis took about 24 hours, after which the picture of what had happened finally came together. During the first interrogation, when the investigators first mentioned the internet queries, Chloe behaved calmly and confidently. She explained that she had been scared and confused and therefore tried to find information about how serious Lily's injury might be. At the time, her explanation sounded quite logical and convincing, and the police officers could not immediately refute her words. But now, after a detailed examination of the phone data, this version began to fall apart. The experts restored the exact chronology of Chloe's actions on the evening of December 27th. The first query was made at 11:30 p.m. and sounded specific and alarming. Symptoms: internal bleeding in toddlers. 5 minutes later, at 11:35 p.m., another query was sent. How long can person be unconscious after blow? Such queries clearly indicated an awareness of the serious situation. But what was more important was something else. What happened after these searches? For the next 20 minutes, Chloe periodically opened social media apps, scrolling through the newsfeed, which did not correspond to the behavior of a person in a state of shock. After that, a period of complete digital silence ensued, lasting over an hour. During this entire time, not a single call to 911 was registered, not a single message to Sarah, no attempt to seek help from neighbors or loved ones. Cell tower data confirmed that the phone was constantly in her house until 1:05 a.m. and did not leave that location. It was only about 90 minutes after the first queries that Chloe drove towards the hospital, arriving there at 1:15 a.m. This entire timeline clearly contradicted her previous explanations of confusion and panic. The detectives conducted another interrogation, now asking much more detailed and precise questions. Chloe once again maintained her composure and continued to insist that she had hoped all along that Lily would regain consciousness on her own, and had been afraid of making the wrong decisions. But now, her words sounded significantly less convincing, as the investigation had clear technical evidence of her deliberate inaction. Police psychologists analyzed her behavior and concluded that it was absolutely not in line with a typical stress reaction. Normally, in critical situations, people either immediately turn to help or act chaotically and spontaneously. But Chloe did nothing of the sort. On the contrary, her behavior seemed methodical, calculated, and cold. She did not call, did not ask for help, did not try to find another way out. She simply waited. It was precisely this deliberate inaction, technically recorded, that became the main argument for the investigation. An hour and a half, during which not a single attempt was made to save Lily, could not be justified by mere fear or confusion. this was something else, something deeper and more unsettling. Thus, the re-examination of the phone data not only confirmed the police's suspicions, but also gave them clear indications that the delay was not an accident or confusion. Chloe was obviously aware of the consequences of her actions and inactions, and was likely even counting on a certain outcome. Now the investigation faced the necessity of finding out the most important thing: the motive. The detectives had to understand why Chloe waited those 90 minutes and what exactly she was hoping to see before making the decision to finally take Lily to the hospital. On the morning of January 2nd, the detectives returned to Chloe Benson's house. The previous search, conducted a few days earlier, had been superficial and had only given the police an initial understanding of the situation. At that time, the detectives had seized Chloe's phone, the initial examination of which had revealed suspicious internet queries and strange behavior. But a deeper technical analysis of the device took time and revealed even more disturbing details. The consistency of this data with the forensic examiner's report, which pointed to old rib fractures in Lily, made the police certain what happened was not an accident. It was a series of deliberate and consistent actions. After receiving an expanded search warrant, the police returned to Chloe's house, this time with a clear idea of what they were looking for. They suspected that the suspect might be keeping her own records or a diary in which she recorded the results of her manipulations and observations. The house once again greeted them with an unsettling order, in which every little thing seemed coordinated and flawless. It was precisely this perfect cleanliness that made the experienced detectives suspicious. They knew well that behind an external gloss often lies the darkest truth. Slowly and methodically, they searched every room. In the bedroom, the top drawer of a dresser caught the attention of one of the officers. The linen in it was folded unnaturally tightly, as if it had been deliberately placed that way to hide something at the bottom. After carefully removing the stack of ironed sheets, the detective discovered a thin grey notebook, on the cover of which was a small inscription, Medical Diary L. In the first few seconds, the find did not seem unusual, but after just a few lines were read, it became clear that the police were not just looking at a diary. Inside, there were no medical records or descriptions of injury symptoms. The author only recorded Sarah's emotional reactions to each incident, as if observing an experiment. The first entry from November 25th, the day Lily was injured on the swing, described in detail Sarah's fear and panic, her repeated calls to Chloe, and the feeling of deep gratitude. Not a word was said about the injury itself. This was not the record of a caring person, but the report of a cold observer, dispassionately recording the result of the manipulation. The next entry from December 9th described the episode with the food poisoning, which had been intentionally caused by expired milk. The author of the diary again showed no emotion regarding Lily's condition, focusing exclusively on her mother's reactions. And again, this corresponded perfectly with the medical data confirming old fractures that Lily had sustained during the same period. With each page of the notebook, the police officer's certainty grew. They had found not just a piece of evidence, but a document that confirmed the cruel and deliberate actions of the suspect. Chloe described the injuries and the mother's reactions like the results of experiments in which pain was merely an instrument for obtaining absolute emotional control. Now it became clear why Lily did not tell her mother or other adults anything. Most likely, the girl perceived her injuries as random events. Chloe could have convinced her that what was happening was normal, or intimidated her by suggesting that no one would believe her. The child became an unwilling and helpless participant in this monstrous experiment. The notebook was carefully secured, photographed, and added to the case file. This find significantly influenced the course of the investigation and finally removed the investigators' doubts. Now they understood that the tragedy was no accident. Before them lay the diary of a manipulator, a person who not only inflicted harm but deliberately turned the pain and despair of her loved ones into her personal power. The investigation was faced with the task of finding out how deep and how far Chloe had gone in her terrifying actions, and for how long she had been playing this game before the final tragedy occurred. After the discovery of the diary, the investigation was faced with the need to clarify its precise meaning. It was obviously not a diary and not an emotional confession. The record seemed like a report, methodically compiled by a person who was documenting the emotions of those around her. To accurately interpret the contents of the notebook, experts were brought in: a graphologist and a forensic psychologist. First, the diary landed on the graphologist's desk. His task was to confirm the authorship of the records. The expert noted that the handwriting in the notebook was neat and clear, without fluctuations or emotion. Such a writing style indicates a personality prone to self-control, discipline, and the need to keep everything under their full control. After a few days, the expert confirmed all the records were made by Chloe's hand. Then the materials were given to the forensic psychologist, who faced a deeper task: to uncover the author's motives and logic. After studying the records, the specialist pointed out that they followed a clear pattern. First, an event was described, then the mother's emotional reactions: her fear, anxiety, gratitude. But in no line were there words of sympathy or care on the part of the author. The records resembled a protocol of an experiment, in which feelings were replaced by a dry registration of results. The psychologist concluded that the suspect's main interest was not in the physical consequences of her actions, but in the psychological effect. Her obsessive attention to the mother's emotional state underscored her need to dominate the situation. By creating crises, she observed the development of events and then received the desired feeling of superiority by acting as the only one who could solve the problem. The expert separately noted the impersonality of the language of the records, which consisted of short, mechanical phrases, emphasizing the author's absolute emotional coldness. The records lacked personal experiences or even a hint of remorse. All this did not seem like personal notes, but rather like laboratory observations, where reality was reduced to a schema: event, reaction, result. Based on the analysis, the forensic psychologist gave a clear qualification of Chloe's behavior, which fully fit the clinical picture of Munchausen syndrome by proxy. In this disorder, a person deliberately causes illnesses or injuries to people dependent on them in order to attract attention, sympathy, and gratitude. Such people feel a pathological dependence on being at the center of an emotional crisis, simultaneously acting as its creator and as the rescuing hero. Thus, the suspect's motive became obvious to the investigation. Chloe was not driven by aggression or envy, but by a pathological need to be needed and important. She was fixated on the role of the hero, which she had invented for herself and systematically brought to life. The events were for her only a means to achieve what she desired: recognition, attention, and emotional power. The obtained expert opinions became an important part of the evidence base. Now the police could confidently assert that Chloe's actions were systematic and deliberate in nature. She did not act impulsively. Each of her actions was part of a consciously organized scheme aimed at gaining power through the suffering of others. The investigation was no longer an everyday story about an accident or a mistake. The detectives were facing a person for whom the pain and despair of her loved ones had become a means of self-affirmation. The investigation was faced with the task of finding out how long this cruel scheme had existed, why no one from her circle had recognized it earlier, and how far the suspect could go while continuing this terrifying game. After the experts presented their opinions on the diary, Chloe Benson's lawyer began to insist that the records had no connection to the real events. The defense claimed that the discovered medical diary L was merely a product of the suspect's imagination and a personal therapy, which did not reflect her actual actions. The version put forward by the defense was simple and at first glance believable. According to Chloe, Lily had accidentally fallen out of bed in her sleep and hit a nearby table. Chloe's statement seemed quite natural and could have convinced someone unfamiliar with the case files, but the investigation already had enough reasons to doubt. To finally verify the reality of this version, the police organized an investigative experiment right in the room where the incident had allegedly occurred, according to Chloe. The bed named by the suspect turned out to be low, a little over half a meter from the floor. Next to it stood a small nightstand with rounded edges, and the floor was covered with a dense carpet that noticeably cushioned impacts. The expert team prepared a special doll that fully matched Lily's weight and height to replicate the conditions of the incident as accurately as possible. The investigators conducted several simulations of the situation, where the doll rolled off the bed from different angles, positions, and with varying force. Each time, the specialists carefully recorded the points of contact with the surfaces, the degree of damage, and the force of the impacts. Despite the variety of scenarios, the result remained unchanged. The injuries described in the medical report could not be reproduced even under the harshest conditions of the experiment. The forensic expert explained in detail why Chloe's version of an accidental collision with furniture could not be the cause of such injuries. He emphasized that the injuries found during the autopsy indicated a much stronger, more direct, and targeted mechanical impact than a fall from a low height. Even an impact on the edge of a hard piece of furniture could not physically have led to a rupture of internal organs and numerous fractures, especially considering that the floor was covered with a thick carpet. After completing the experiment, the investigative team had convincing evidence that definitively refuted the defense's version. The records of the investigative experiment were attached to the case file and vividly demonstrated the impossibility of Chloe's version. Her claims completely lost their persuasiveness and now seemed deliberately fabricated. The results of this check revealed the suspect's true intentions. Chloe had been giving false testimony from the very beginning, deliberately trying to divert the investigation from the true state of affairs. She hoped that the simple domestic version would seem so mundane that no one would bother to check it. However, the professionalism and thoroughness of the investigators destroyed this plan. Now the police were finally convinced. The suspect was not a victim of circumstances or chance. She did not lose control of the situation, but on the contrary, actively steered the investigation down a false path to hide her deliberate actions behind the guise of a mundane accident. The investigation was preparing to move on to the next stage, to present to the court not just a story of a tragedy, but a case of deliberate and premeditated actions aimed at causing harm. Chloe herself created situations, herself documented their consequences, and herself tried to use deception to evade responsibility. Now the investigation was ready to reveal to the court the full depth of her cold-blooded manipulation. When the investigation turned to analyzing the background of Chloe Benson, it turned out that, at first glance, her life was impeccable. Neighbors and acquaintances spoke of her as a benevolent and reliable woman. In the police archives, there were neither complaints nor calls from social services, nor any suspicious entries. Everything looked as if they were dealing with an ordinary single mother who cared for her child. Nevertheless, the investigators decided to check Chloe's previous places of employment. The data showed that in 2021, she had worked at a veterinary clinic and had been dismissed for violating internal medical procedures. The wording of the document sounded neutral, but former colleagues reported more disturbing details. During Chloe's shifts, cases of sudden deterioration in the condition of animals were often recorded, although there had been no prior symptoms. At the same time, Chloe was the first to come to the rescue, saving the pets and receiving praise. The clinic staff initially did not associate this with anything intentional. Chloe seemed proactive and caring, until the pattern became too obvious. The medical records showed that some data was changed precisely after her shift, and she entered treatment rooms without warning. The clinic management decided not to call the police and simply dismissed her to avoid a scandal. When expert psychologists analyzed these episodes, they saw a pattern. Outwardly, Chloe was an exemplary employee, but in situations where she could control the outcome, another side of her behavior emerged. A similar pattern was already repeating in Lily's case. This early case confirmed that the suspect had repeatedly used the weakness of others as an instrument of her own importance. Now it was clear. She had always been playing rescuer, only before the patients couldn't talk. The investigation concluded. The current incident was not the beginning, but the end point of a chain. Lily was the first whose consequences became irreversible. Now the police had to find out how many similar episodes had gone unnoticed and how many victims remained outside the official reports. The investigation gained a new vector. The case was now considered not as a single tragedy, but as part of a long-standing pattern of behavior. After all the necessary expert examinations were completed, Chloe Benson was brought to the station for a final interrogation on the evening of January 10th. This time, the investigators had irrefutable proof of her guilt in their hands, and they expected to receive clear answers. The atmosphere in the room was stark and laconic. Bright light, a table, several chairs, and nothing superfluous. Chloe entered and sat down without any sign of agitation, looking at Detective Marlowe with feigned indifference. He opened a folder in front of him and got straight to the point. Marlowe presented the results of the graphological analysis, which confirmed that the diary had been written in her hand. Chloe took this information calmly without attempting to object. Then he showed her the forensic psychologist's report, which detailed that the diary entries corresponded with real events and medical reports of Sarah's emergency calls. When the detective read a few excerpts from the diary, matching dates and facts, Chloe showed a slight unease for the first time. She tensed up slightly and turned away. She no longer seemed as self-assured as she had at the beginning of the conversation. Marlowe calmly moved on to the digital evidence, the search history on her phone on the night of the tragedy. He read out 2 queries, about the symptoms of internal bleeding and about how long a person can be unconscious. Then he reminded her that an hour and a half had passed after these queries before she took Lily to the hospital. During this time, the suspect had not called anyone and had not tried to get help. Chloe again tried to stick to her original version, explaining the delay with panic and confusion. But Marlowe immediately presented her with the results of the investigative experiment, which completely refuted the possibility of such severe injuries from a fall from the bed. This piece of evidence finally deprived her explanations of any logic. The tension in the room grew. The detective also reminded Chloe of the past events at the veterinary clinic, mentioning the specialist's conclusions about the repetitive nature of her behavior. He emphasized that similar situations had occurred before, and this could not be a simple coincidence. Chloe could no longer contain herself. Her tone became sharp, and she stated that she refused to continue the conversation without her lawyer present. After that, the suspect ceased contact and fell silent, showing complete disinterest in everything happening around her. The interrogation ended without any further explanations. Early on the morning of January 11th, Chloe Benson was officially arrested and transferred to the Fayette County Detention Center, where she would await the start of her trial. The investigative phase was complete. Now the police had to present all the collected evidence to the jury. The investigators understood that they were not dealing with an accident or a mistake, but with the deliberate actions of a person who used the lives of others to satisfy her own needs for recognition and attention. October 2024. The trial in the case of Chloe Benson was underway in the Fayette County Court. For the jury, it was a difficult process. Overly convoluted psychological motives and medical expert reports. The prosecution understood that they needed a clear and unambiguous fact that anyone could immediately grasp without lengthy explanations. On this day, Lily's mother, Sarah Welsh, was scheduled to testify. She slowly approached the witness stand, her voice trembling, but she seemed completely sincere. Sarah told the court how completely she had trusted Chloe. She confirmed that last December, Chloe had explained the appearance of a bruise on Lily's shoulder as a simple household accident. The girl had allegedly accidentally bumped herself on the corner of the coffee table in the living room. The prosecutor asked Sarah to confirm this explanation once more. The woman confidently stated again that Chloe had explained what happened to her in exactly that way, and she remembered this version precisely. She had not even thought to check details or ask questions. So strong was her trust. The prosecutor approached the table and took out one of the photographs that police officers had taken during the inspection of Sarah's apartment at the beginning of the investigation. He turned to the jury and calmly showed them the picture. The photo clearly showed the room where that very table which Sarah had spoken of was located. The jurors immediately noticed an important detail. The table was round without a single sharp edge. A deep silence fell. This simple fact irrefutably proved that Chloe had deliberately lied. She knew that Sarah, absorbed in work and fatigue, would not question her words and would not check the truth of what was said. The prosecutor emphasized that such a lie was not a simple accident, but a cool and clear calculation. It was a method to make Sarah rely completely on Chloe and not ask unnecessary questions. The defense tried to seize the initiative, asking why Lily herself had never told her mother about her injuries. In response, the prosecutor called the forensic psychologist to the witness stand, who calmly and understandably explained the behavior of young children in such circumstances. He clarified that Lily was completely dependent on Chloe, trusted her, and believed her explanations. The expert added that a child in such a situation often avoids talking about their injuries because they feel guilty or are simply unable to correctly explain their sensations. The psychologist also clarified the question of why even such serious injuries as rib fractures went unnoticed by the mother. He pointed out that children cannot always clearly describe the source of pain and often speak in general phrases about feeling unwell. Sarah, in turn, constantly working and completely convinced by Chloe's words, perceived her daughter's complaints as ordinary childhood problems. The psychologist's testimony eliminated the last questions for the jury. It became obvious. Chloe purposefully manipulated the trust of both mother and daughter, creating conditions under which neither could see the true cause of the problems. Sarah sighed heavily at that moment, without raising her eyes. She realized that her absolute trust had allowed Chloe to completely control the situation. Now it hurt her to understand how easily she had become part of someone else's game, in which her own fatigue and concern for her family had become a weapon against herself. The prosecution concluded its presentation, leaving the jury with a simple, understandable, and irrefutable piece of evidence. Now all the details fell into a clear, logical chain, and the case was finally approaching its conclusion. Despite the vast amount of evidence, the court still could not answer the most important question of this case. What exactly happened on the night of December 28th in Chloe's house? The jury knew everything. Dates, diary entries, medical reports, calls to emergency services. But one event, a specific action that led to Lily's fatal injury, remained unclear. And it was precisely on this that the defense lawyer decided to stake his case on the final day of the trial. He admitted that the diary and the events matched, admitted that Chloe had written those entries. But in doing so, the lawyer stated that not a single entry directly proved that the defendant herself had inflicted any injuries. He continued to insist that the exact coincidences could merely be the result of Chloe's anxious nature, who intuitively anticipated possible problems and recorded them in advance. The defense claimed that the prosecution lacked the most important thing, direct proof of the moment the injury was inflicted. But the prosecutor was prepared for this argument. He stood up and calmly, without emotion, went over the key moments presented earlier once more. A detailed timeline of events appeared on the screen, each point of which was documented. He showed November 25th. In the diary, an entry about a fall from a swing, and in the medical records, bruises and hematomas that corresponded exactly to these circumstances. December 9th, an entry about an experiment with milk and a call to 911 with complaints of a sharp deterioration in Lily's condition. And finally, December 18th. Restoration of trust coincides with emotional messages from Sarah to Chloe. The prosecutor explained that these facts proved one thing. The diary did not record events after they had happened. On the contrary, the entries appeared either immediately before or immediately after the situation occurred. This meant that Chloe was not just predicting, She was deliberately creating each crisis. Then he moved on to the main event of the night of December 28th. The medical expert explained once again that Lily's injury was caused by a direct physical impact of considerable force and could not have occurred accidentally, for example, from a fall from the bed. However, the expert also acknowledged that it was already impossible to determine the specific object or the exact action that had led to the injury. The defense again tried to take advantage of this, emphasizing that the lack of specifics in the mechanism of injury left too much room for doubt. But the prosecutor was already ready to counter this statement. He reminded the jury of the most important fact. On the night of the incident, Chloe had spent a full hour and a half searching for information about the symptoms of internal bleeding instead of immediately calling for help. This clearly indicated her awareness of the seriousness of the situation and a deliberate inaction, which in itself is a crime. The prosecutor added that the physical mystery, what exactly the blow was delivered with, did not absolve Chloe of responsibility. On the contrary, her stubborn silence and refusal to explain what happened speak to a conscious desire to hide important circumstances of the case. The jury did not need to search for irrefutable details of the crime's mechanism. It was enough for them to see clearly who was with Lily during those last 1.5 hours and who deliberately delayed the call to the emergency services. After these words, the defendant again did not raise her eyes. She did not say a word and did not make a single gesture to show any relation to what was happening. Her entire defense line consisted only of silence, which became less convincing with each passing hour. The prosecutor emphasized that although one specific fact of that night remained unknown, the chain of other evidence left no doubt. It was precisely Chloe who bore full responsibility for what happened. The final uncertainty could no longer be her defense. Now the mystery was working against her. The jury already had detailed information about the diary, medical documents, and the consistency of the data, but one crucial moment remained unclear: how exactly the events of that night had unfolded. The prosecutor began his narrative calmly, meticulously reconstructing the sequence of Chloe's actions on the night of December 28th. According to the investigation's reconstruction, Sarah brought Lily to Chloe's house on the evening of December 27th. The mother noticed nothing unusual. The girl felt fine, was active, and her mood was normal. However, the situation changed around 11 o'clock at night. The investigators believed that it was during this period that Chloe inflicted the fatal injury on Lily. The forensic medical examiner explained that the nature of the injuries pointed to a clear, conscious, and controlled blow, aimed at causing symptoms that would not manifest immediately. The expert emphasized that such an injury could not have happened by chance. It was a deliberate action. Around 11:30 p.m., Lily began to feel worse, and Chloe, instead of calling for help, started searching the internet for information about signs of internal injuries and the time after which they become critical. The prosecutor drew the jury's attention to the fact that this was not panicked behavior. The queries were made with methodical regularity, obviously with the aim of assessing the situation and calculating the moment to seek medical help. 1.5 hours. That is exactly how long Chloe took no action, waiting for the symptoms to become dramatic. The prosecutor called this not fear or confusion, but a deliberate waiting for the right moment. According to the forensic psychologist, the goal was obvious: to bring Lily to the hospital at the very moment when her condition seemed maximally dangerous, but at the same time, still allowed for hope of a successful rescue. Chloe knew that Sarah worked at the hospital and expected that it would be the mother who would see her in the role of the hero who had brought Lily in at the last moment. This was not just manipulation, but an entire performance aimed at receiving attention and sympathy. But the prosecution placed emphasis on one important moment. Chloe had miscalculated the time. By the time she finally brought Lily to the hospital, the girl's condition was already irreversible. Chloe intended to appear at the right moment, but she made a mistake and lost control of the situation. The prosecutor stressed that Chloe had not planned a tragedy. She had planned a triumph. But in her dangerous game, tragedy became inevitable. Her guilt lay precisely in the fact that she deliberately exposed Lily to risk, understood the possible consequences, but ignored them for the sake of her own scenario. When the prosecutor finished, the courtroom froze. The jury no longer needed to clarify any details. They had been clearly shown what happened, why, and who was to blame. All that remained was to make the final decision. When the jurors returned to the courtroom, the tension became almost physically palpable. The foreman of the jury stood up and read the verdict, looking straight ahead. Chloe Benson was found guilty on all counts. The defendant heard the verdict without showing the slightest emotion. No surprise, no fear, no remorse, just silence, and a gaze fixed somewhere through the proceedings. She seemed to have been prepared for this outcome for a long time. The judge briefly announced the sentence: life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Sarah, who until then had been holding on only with great difficulty, could no longer hide her feelings. Upon hearing the verdict, she wept silently, covering her face with her hands. A few staff members carefully helped her leave the courtroom. For her, this verdict meant only one thing: the confirmation of a terrible reality with which she had to continue living. Chloe was led out of the courtroom calmly and silently. She did not turn around, did not try to look at Sarah or the jury, just walked as if everything had long been over and this moment was just a formality. A heavy, oppressive silence hung in the courtroom. Everyone understood. The formal verdict had been delivered, but the weight of this case had by no means disappeared. Now all that was left was to continue living, carrying the memory of what had happened. After the verdict was announced, everyone involved in this case tried to return to life in their own way. Sarah underwent a long course of treatment for post-traumatic stress disorder, changed cities and her social circle to try to stop mentally returning to that December. Later, she filed a civil lawsuit against the hospital administration and the Child Protection Services on the grounds that the alarming signs of injuries and the frequent doctor visits should have alerted them long before everything happened. Benson is currently serving her sentence in the Kentucky State Women's Prison. Psychologists who observe her in custody note her calm behavior and her ability to adapt to the conditions of life behind bars. At the same time, she continues to maintain a stubborn silence about the events of the night of December 27th. Not to a single person, including her lawyers and psychologists, has she ever told how exactly the fatal injury was inflicted. The case itself had a significant impact on the work of the city's medical and social institutions. After conducted reviews, the rules for responding to suspicious cases and symptoms were tightened to prevent the recurrence of similar situations in the future. But one detail of this crime was never uncovered. The exact way in which the defendant had inflicted those injuries remained a mystery. Despite the proven guilt and confirmed motive, her silence did not allow for a complete clarification of the picture of what had happened. It was this unresolved circumstance that became the final reminder that far from everything can be uncovered, even after the conclusion of a court case.